Hi, my name is Makasy, and as you can see by the title, by the thumbnail, today I am finally doing a collection video. I love watching collection video because you can really sense the passion when they speak about their collection. You can sense how proud this person is with regard to how many items that they own from a brand that they love, a brand that makes wearing clothes more than just a task that was imposed by society standard. And then, in the title, they obviously do the whole 10,000 collection, $20,000 collection, 50, 5,000, 6,000. And obviously I did the same. You got to drive viewerships in it. You got to entice the consumers in there. So this is going to be a long video. So please get some food, get some snacks, some peanuts, some cereal, whatever you eat while you watch videos on YouTube, whatever you eat while you watch Netflix. So just enjoy. We're going to go through 10K worth of clothing. So I'm going to tally up the total in this corner so you guys can keep track. Let's get started. The first item, we have this beautiful windbreaker. This is a lambskin exterior and lamb shearling interior. Such a beautiful material. What I love about this jacket more than the material is not more. What I love about this jacket also is the glove detailing that's attached to the jacket. It's so good. You don't find a lot of jackets with this detail, and when you do, you're paying a pretty penny, and I did too. So this jacket retailed for, I believe, $6,125. If I'm incorrect, I'm sure editor Makasy will correct it in the corner, but I love it. I love the fact that, also, since I have gloves on the end, if you don't want to put your hand in the glove, the forearm area, there are zippers, so then you can just put your arm through there. Very multifaceted. I love this jacket, and it's kind of reversible, but not really. You can reverse it, you just can't reverse the glove part. So when you do wear it with the shearling out, you just have to always keep your hand through the forearm holes and not through the glove. I didn't think I would like it that much because I always like to have the shearling as like a cute little detail like here and there, but for the shearling to be completely on the outside, I thought it was a bit counterintuitive. But since I've started wearing this inside out, it feels really good and it looks really good. Sometimes you just want to feel the leather on your body instead of the shearling. And if you want to hear more about this jacket, I made a really in-depth video, but to be honest with you, I might redo that video because I have gotten so much better at editing, at scripting, at line delivery. I've gotten so much better than everything. But yeah, I'll think about redoing it. It's a solid video, but I think this is just one of those situations. You know how like when you post photos on Instagram, you always like zoom into every corner. Oh my God, there's this stuff here that's not be there. Oh, it's darker than I wanted it to be. But in reality, from the perspective of people scrolling on Instagram, they're not going to zoom into every corner. So it's one of those situations where I'm finding flaws with it because I created it. Once again, this jacket retailed for $6,125, and if me getting this jacket for that much money impresses you, then yes, of course I did. Of course I got it for that price. However, if you think it's dumb as hell to buy a jacket that's retail for $6,000, dude, I didn't get this for $6,000. I got this like for way cheaper, for like what, $250? I got it on this new website that I recently discovered. I think it's pronounced AliExpress, something like that. I think it's French. Okay, so the next item. So this is the Rick Owens leather Bauhaus jumpsuit in stretch lambskin leather. This piece, it is so insane. Okay, well, to me, it's not that insane because I previously owned the TE version, so I know what it feels like to wear it already, but it is a new material. So, okay, let's put it this way. If this were to be my first official jumpsuit, I would feel so overwhelmed because the lambskin leather, it's stretched, it's blended with lycra and cotton. It's a new type of leather for me, so it opens up a new avenue for me to research, for me to test out and just see what it's like to own this new type of leather. It feels so luxurious. I love lambskin. I think I've gotten it down now. If I can choose, I would not get calf leather. I would prefer lamb, or I prefer horse. But calf is always gonna be at the lowest in terms of like choice of leather for me. And Rick, this jumpsuit was made in the south of France. Rick partnered with this tannery or company that deal exclusively with stretch leather. It's a beautiful garment. And this flight suit or jumpsuit retail for $5,400. So add the total up. So yeah, thank you very much for watching my 10,000 collection video of 10,000 Rick Owens collection video. I will see you next week. Bye-bye.
There is but one truly serious philosophical question, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. These are games. One must first answer. Okay, so welcome back to Existential Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. And if you're familiar with the writings of Albert Camus, you probably recognize that as the beginning to The Myth of Sisyphus and other essays. And that's the text we're going to be covering in the next few lectures. So, to my left, to your right, is a reading assignment from that book, so 3 to 123 from The Myth of Sisyphus. And I prefaced your notes with, I think, one of the great provocative quotes from Camus, of which he has many. All great deeds and all great thoughts have a ridiculous beginning. So kind of a deflationary remark, I think, about our hubris and our tendency to exaggerate our own importance and self-importance. At any rate, so the question of suicide is, for Camus, the fundamental question subtending all of philosophy. Our relation to life, and whether life is or is not worth living, and under what terms, is ultimately the only serious philosophical question. Now, when he poses this kind of provocative statement, it's probably easiest to think of suicide in its most literal form. In other words, the extinguishing of our biological continuity. However, much more commonly, we commit suicide in a figurative kind of way, and he calls that figurative way philosophical suicide. So most of the time in this particular work, he's going to be examining philosophical suicide, although literal suicide is certainly included within the purview of his inquiry too. So the question is, what is philosophical suicide? Well, let's look at suicide first in its generality. For Camus, suicide is a response to the ultimate absurdity of life. It's not so much a response to the fact that life is painful, because the fact is that when things make sense to us, when things are coherent, when we have a sense of purpose or meaning, we can endure quite a bit of suffering, actually. So the question of suicide ultimately isn't so much about suffering, it's more about absurdity, futility, and meaninglessness, because those sorts of factors are what makes suffering unendurable. So suicide is a response to realizing ultimately how absurd and futile and meaningless life actually is. When you're honest about it, normally we're not very honest about that. We cover it over in various ways, which we'll get into probably in 10 minutes or so in this lecture. So the question at this point is, what is philosophical suicide? Well, philosophical suicide is a way of, as it were, killing off the inquiring and honest part of our minds, the part of our minds that would allow us to recognize exactly how absurd and futile and meaningless life is, a way of sort of shutting that part of our native curiosity down, killing off that part of our perceptual field, as it were. Now, how might we go about doing this, committing philosophical suicide, even if, as we're doing it, we're moving about in the world and our biological continuity is happening over years and years? Well, there are any number of ways, but the way that he looks at particularly has to do with belief in God. So the question is, how is belief in God or believing in God a way of killing off part of our minds and part of our perceptual fields? Well, here's how it works. Basically, we believe in God for 2 reasons, one of which has to do with our longing for definite answers to the questions that naturally occur to us as human beings. Fundamental questions like, where did the universe come from? Where did we come from? Where are we going, especially after we die? Is there any point to our existence? Those kinds of questions are natural enough for human beings because we have a reflective capacity and a cognitive capacity. And so it's a very natural thing for us to wonder about them. But the thing is, when we wonder about them and we look to life itself for answers, life doesn't provide answers to those kinds of questions. Life doesn't tell us where we come from or where the universe came from or what's going to happen to us after we die or anything like that, or whether there's a point to life, etc. We look to life for those kinds of answers, and life just meets us with a kind of impassive silence. And it's a very anxiety-provoking thing. It's a very strange thing to be met with silence when we voice, at least to ourselves, those kinds of fundamental questions. It's really kind of bizarre when you think about it. When you think about it, it's much easier to tell someone the answer to something of, sort of microscopic significance. Like, for instance, it's very easy to tell someone how to sign on to YouTube, let's say. You just type in YouTube here, or you can give the full URL and type it in this other place, and you just hit the return, and now you're on YouTube. That kind of very detailed, very small kind of information occurs to us very easily. Like, most of us are very fluent in that sort of thing. But the absurdity of our existential predicament is that when it comes to the most fundamental questions, the most basic questions, the ones that subtend all of the particular moments of our lives, all of a sudden it becomes very difficult to say anything substantive and definite about it. And the reason why is because life itself is not giving us anything substantive or definite to say about it. Doesn't tell us what the point of our lives is. It kind of just, like I said, it kind of meets us with silence and sort of expects us, seemingly, to come up with our own answers to those kinds of questions because it's not providing any answers, at least nothing definite and palpable to us. So philosophical suicide is a response to the absurdity and futility of life by shutting down those kinds of questions, especially by providing easy, stopgap answers to them. So believing in something performs a kind of psychological function for us because it alleviates our anxiety about how absurd our existential predicament is, that we have these kinds of longings for definite answers, that we really want to know what our lives are about, we would really like to know what the rules of the game are, but life tells us nothing definite about that. And although life is absurd in any number of ways, for Camus, this is the most central way that we don't get. The last thing we get is the answers for which we long most for. And so belief in God or any sort of religious structure or any sort of doctrine that would seemingly provide answers to those kinds of fundamental questions is for him a form of philosophical suicide, a way of shutting down the kind of honest recognition that life is not providing us with what we really want, which is answers as to its nature, and in the process is quite absurd, quite ridiculous, quite strange. So once again, we're not normally that honest to recognize that, but for Camus, the myth of Sisyphus and other essays is really an attempt to be, I guess, one way of seeing it would be an attempt to be much more honest than we typically are about the nature of our existential predicament. So believing in God tells us where the universe came from. It was created in 7 days, and on the seventh day God rested, or what have you. It depends upon the religion, obviously. I'm giving you a Christian sort of rendition because that's the one I'm most familiar with. It tells us what the point of our lives is, and that is to live according to the edicts of Christian virtue, to be saved and redeemed from our sins along the way. And that is really the whole point of our lives, because it's only insofar as that we'll meet with one judgment or another, depending upon how that goes. And that's, in an ultimate sense, what our existence is about. It's about a kind of test to see if we can have faith in God and recognize God as the center of everything, the ultimate creator, big C creator, the Alpha and the Omega, and so on. And if we pass the test, then we end up in a heavenly afterlife. And if we fail the test in some way, then we end up in a hellish kind of afterlife of one sort or another. But the trick, as far as we're talking about now, isn't like about the validity of that. It's more about what it does for us, what believing in the cosmos in that particular way does for us. And for Camus, what it does for us is it shuts down our disquieting anxiety and uncertainty about how ridiculous and how absurd our existential predicament is, particularly because it doesn't provide us with any of the answers for which we really long and which we really want, and which would lend our existence and our time here on the earth a sense of definiteness. We're left in uncertainty, in a vast, vertiginous, disorienting ocean of uncertainty, especially with respect to the most fundamental questions. So believing in, say, a Christian cosmology, by the way, it's not just the Christian cosmology. Pretty much every religion has this function. It gives you some kind of narrative about where you came from and where you're going and what the rules of the game are. So if you adhere to a more Buddhist way of thinking, well, you know, it's like you're going through sequences of reincarnations dictated by karma that ultimately, hopefully, will lead you away from the cycle of samsara and into nirvana at some point. And that's sort of the point of things, for you to take further steps toward enlightenment throughout this life and throughout your future incarnations too. If you believe that, well, you know, life is ultimately about being a valiant warrior so that you can you know, accompany the Valkyries to the halls of Valhalla and hang out with Odin and Wotan and all of those kinds of people, well, same function. It gives you kind of easy stopgap answers for what life does not provide. It provides you with a narrative, a sense of orientation and purpose. But for Camus, at the same time, the cost of believing in something like that is the cost of killing off a part of yourself. The part of yourself that would be direct enough and honest enough to realize that life is not giving you what you want, that is placing you in a fundamentally absurd and precarious situation in simply being human. Okay, now I said earlier that belief in God serves two functions, and we've made note of one of them, which is that it shuts down our uncertainty and our anxiety about not having the answers to the riddle of life. The second function that it serves has to do with justice and our longings for justice. And once again, it's the same sort of arrangement. Most of us have a desire to see people who are good be rewarded for their goodness, and to see people who are bad or evil in some sense be punished. We long for there to be some justice in the world. But the obvious insight, if you just look at what life itself is telling us, is that, well, sometimes things work out that way. Sometimes good people get rewarded for their good behaviors, and sometimes bad people get punished. But a lot of the time, it works the exact opposite way. That good people sometimes are the ones that end up being beaten up and bloodied first and foremost. A lot of the time, people who are basically criminals and ne'er-do-wells and people that you would hope would be punished, a lot of the time they're not punished. A lot of the time they get away with their misdeeds. So if you just look to life for some kind of affirmation of justice, well, it seems like there's a lot of randomness involved in the process. Like maybe if you're good, you'll be rewarded. Maybe you'll be the first to die. That's the reality of it. If you're bad, maybe you'll be punished and maybe you'll get away with it. And for most of us, there's a certain irreducible fraction of anxiety that goes with realizing that directly and honestly. And so another function that belief in God, or any structure that's sort of like that, serves is that it provides us with a narrative that ultimately allows us to think that at the end of the day, good people will be rewarded, bad people will be punished. That's sort of obvious in the Christian account of things because we have heaven and hell and more or less righteous good people go to heaven and unrepentant sinners go to hell. In a Buddhist framework, we have the workings of karma, wherein you might be born into the realm of hungry ghosts, is one of the sort of parts of Tibetan Buddhism. There's six realms that you could possibly end up in your next incarnation, and one of them is a realm where you're sort of infinitely hungry, but you have a microscopic mouth to take things in, which sounds like such a painful, awful realm to inhabit. But if your karma is of a certain structure, that's where it'll end up. If you're, I guess, not a valiant warrior from a Nordic point of view, but you're a weaselly scoundrel and cutthroat, you will not end up in the halls of Valhalla. I'm not sure where you end up within that framework, but at any rate, it's not anywhere good. The point is that all of these religious ways of seeing life, basically, besides giving us easy answers to all of life's uncertainties, provide us with some sense of justice in the universe, wherein we have a way of thinking about life in terms of good people being rewarded and bad people being punished. Okay, so the reason why we commit philosophical suicide is, for the most part, we can't bear the anxiety of all of the uncertainty that attends both life's fundamental questions, and also we can't bear the anxiety of thinking that life basically doesn't care about fairness. But that's more or less the way it is. Like, if you look at the natural world, well, it's easy to see scenes of young antelopes being torn apart by hyenas, if you watch a nature special or something like that. And, for most of us, it seems like just, probably a terrible tragedy. Like, why would life need to be structured that way, where that thing would be happening not just on nature specials that you watch, but it's happening all the time in the natural world, that creatures that, have committed seemingly no transgression or no foul deed end up meeting the most horrific of deaths. Well, the thing is, we're not any different in principle from that. That life will cut you down if you're a good person just as quickly as it'll cut down a bad person. So that's the nature of philosophical suicide. Now, Camus also gives a name to what we've been calling the absurdity of life, and the name he gives is the absurd, okay, with a definite article in front of it. The is a definite article in grammar. So the trick to first getting a handle on the absurd is to realize that it's not just the sensation of absurdity that you feel every now and then, and probably most of us feel it every now and then. Every now and then you get the sensation that life is just so weird and so bizarre and so nonsensical that it becomes absurd. Well, the thing is, that's a particular experience, but for Camus, the reason why he calls it the absurd is that for him, absurdity is not just something that crops up every now and then in our experience of life. The absurd is something on the order of an ontological category. Okay, so what's an ontological category? An ontological category is a basic structure of being itself. In other words, his insight is that the reason why we sometimes have these experiences of absurdity in our lives is because life is already absurd in principle, and it's only because it's structured that way from the ground up that we can have these sorts of experiences in the first place. When we experience the sensation of absurdity every now and then, what's really happening is we're glimpsing something about how life itself is structured. We're gaining an insight into the sort of basic, foundational, ground level way that life already is. So that if you've ever had the sensation that, well, you're really in a ludicrous predicament in being alive as a human being, well, for Camus, there's a really good reason for that. And the reason is because that's exactly how life is. That's exactly how it is. And you're only now realizing it. You've somehow torn yourself away from the consensual, self-serving hallucination that life is something just, and life is something coherent, and life is something sensible with a definite point to it. You've torn yourself away from that, and now you're finally seeing the real truth of things. And the real truth of things is that you're in a absurd predicament. You're awash in the absurd, in the ocean of the absurd. So that's what it means for the absurd to be an ontological category. Now, like I said earlier, most of us don't have enough honesty to recognize that directly. Most of us commit philosophical suicide in one form or another. Oh, and by the way, I should mention this, that there are secular ways of committing philosophical suicide too. It's not just that religion serves that function for Camus. It's also that there's secular ways of doing it. For instance, if you are buying into a kind of scientific / industrial / technological utopian dream wherein if we just keep pursuing life in a scientific, rational, reasonable way, that eventually we'll end up in some sort of utopian state, well, life doesn't provide any confirmation of that either. In fact, if you look at the history of the last 100 years or so, well, it seems like a lot of that technological know-how and a lot of that rational inquiry into the way reality is structured, we use to, on a fairly regular basis, commit genocide with each other and oppress each other and torment each other. And that rides right alongside all of the wonderful benefits of living in an industrial technological world too. So the point is that, if you place all your chips on the square of, well, eventually, science will yield up some kind of utopian state for humanity. Well, good luck with that, because the jury's definitely out on whether that'll actually happen or not. Once again, like I said in the last video, as a product of that same dream, we've wired the entire planet for instantaneous nuclear obliteration. How many nuclear armaments are there in the world? Well, the last estimate I read, which is a few years ago, is 13,700 nuclear armaments in the world. And the thing about nuclear armaments is that just one of them can spoil your whole damn day. So when there's 13,700 of them, you're definitely going to have a bad day if, for some reason, they decide to all go off. It'll be Fallout 4, I suppose, and you'll be trying to find your way to Diamond City, perhaps, fending off super mutants and that sort of thing. So that might not be a reference that all of you get, a little bit of gaming reference there. So at any rate, the question is, at this point, can we do anything other than commit philosophical suicide in one form or another? Actually, sort of side note here, I bet if I had to name the mode of philosophical suicide that's most prevalent in the 21st century when we live, it probably would not be belief in God or anything religious. Probably the most predominant mode of philosophical suicide, I would say, is narcotizing ourselves by way of commodity and entertainment culture. That's the thing we use for the most part that shuts down that sort of honest, inquiring part of our minds and our souls. Like for the most part, when we begin to feel the anxiety of life and the anxiety surrounding the absurdity of life and how unjust life seems to be a lot of the time, the main thing we do is buy more stuff and try to be happy by way of that. Buy more stuff and be happier. I think that's probably the bigger paradigm even than the religious one that Camus comments on, or even the scientific one, which I mentioned too. But at any rate, the question is, okay, end of sidebar moment. All right, so the next question is, can we do anything but commit suicide in one form or another? Either literal suicide or philosophical suicide by way of having some kind of belief structure or narrative that shuts down all the uncertainty of life, or just relying on sort of science / industry / technology to be our default answer that seemingly shuts down all of that stuff. Or on the other hand, narcotizing ourselves into oblivion to the point where we are unable to recognize how strange and weird and absurd life actually is. Are we bound to commit suicide in one of these ways or another? And his answer is that he doesn't really know, but he holds out the possibility that it may be possible. Now, the kind of person who would be able to do this, in other words, to avoid committing all forms of suicide, he gives a special name to, and the special name is the absurd man. Now, I suppose we could update the language of that a little bit, maybe the absurd person or something like that, but I'll stay with absurd man because that's the way it's translated. So the absurd man, what is the business of the absurd man? The absurd man is someone that refuses to default to any form of either literal suicide or figurative philosophical suicide, and instead keeps the fundamental questions of life unanswered and somehow finds a way to tolerate the probably irreducible fraction of anxiety that involves, and finds a way of moving through life nonetheless. So the absurd man, for Camus, is a kind of person who is way more honest and way more direct about human existence than we typically are. So here's his description of the absurd man. It's on the notes. Being able to remain on that dizzying crest of uncertainty before we've defaulted to some belief system or some mode of tranquilization that our society offers up to us. So let me start again on that. Being able to remain on that dizzying crest, that is integrity, and the rest is subterfuge. So subterfuge, okay, possible vocabulary word like sort of tricky deception. Maybe that's a way of glossing subterfuge. Like for the most part, we engage in the tricky deception of philosophical suicide. So for him, being able to maintain ourselves in a very lucid and direct perception of how absurd life is, and yet to find a way of moving through life anyhow, that is really for him like a much more desirable state. Whether anyone's able to do that or not, sort of the jury's out on that, and he admits that he's not quite certain whether this is really reasonable. But at any rate, for this reason, Camus claims that his philosophical position is that of a thoroughgoing atheism. Now, this seems, to my own point of view, like overstating the claim a little bit. Because the thing about atheism, of course, is the contention that God does not exist. Well, the thing is that if we're really in this kind of absurd predicament where we don't know any final answers at all, that, as he describes it, that doesn't sound like atheism, because atheism seems like a very definite statement about the non-existence of God. But his earlier claim is that, well, part of what makes the absurd is not that, but rather the uncertainty about all of that. So personally, I would say that really what his philosophy amounts to is a form of agnosticism rather than atheism. I think the reason why the French existentialists, not all of them, but fairly often will talk about their work in terms of atheism, isn't so much because that's really the logical result of their way of thinking, but rather I think it's an expression of a kind of Parisian tendency toward provocation. Like one of the things about the French existentialists, or I would say French continental philosophy more generally, is this, they're sort of pugnacious about things. Like they want to put up their dukes and defend and advance the most provocative positions possible. And I think the claim to atheism is an expression more of that. But in reality, I think that Camus' philosophy and also Sartre's philosophy, Sartre claims that his philosophy is irreducibly atheistic too. But really what I think they amount to is two different forms of agnosticism rather than atheism. Incidentally, agnosticism is the position that we don't know enough to say whether God exists or not, in case you didn't know that term. Okay, now I wanted to, because this account of Camus' philosophy at this point probably sounds really puzzling. Like, why would anyone want to see the universe or life that way? Like, why would anyone place value on such a difficult, daunting, intimidating life path like that? It can be very difficult, I think, especially at this point, to see like why that might be an attractive position. So to give you a sense for the other side of things, okay, so once again, it's obvious that I have not figured out how to make the camera stop its automatic shut-off function. Okay, so what was I saying before I was so rudely interrupted by the camera shutting off? What I was saying is that at this point in our account, it can be difficult to see how it is that Camus' position can be an attractive position in some sense. In other words, like lucidly and honestly recognizing how uncertain and how absurd life really is seems scary at first, and because it undercuts our reasons for engaging in philosophical suicide, and probably a lot of us derive some measure of comfort from our exercises in philosophical suicide. So to sort of unfold a possible answer to that question, in your notes I made mention of another existential psychologist. This one is currently living, Kirk Schneider. And taking an idea from his book called The Rediscovery of Awe, in which he describes what he calls enchanted agnosticism. Okay, so once again, agnosticism is the position that we don't know enough to ascertain whether God exists or not, or probably in a more general sense. We don't know enough to have definite answers to any of the fundamental questions one way or another that we'd like to have answers to. So the question is, how can agnosticism gain a kind of enchantment for us? How can that be an enchanted position? Well, here's the thing about that. Like when you leave the fundamental questions of life unanswered, when you don't defer to any easy, ready-made answer, whether it's a secular one or a religious one, is sort of beside the point, it can have a way of allowing life and all the fundamental structures of life be mysterious to us in our experience. Why? Because there's no definite, easy answer to what's going on. Well, the positive part of that is that life can remain a kind of mystery to us, and our engagement with life can be permeated with a sense of mystery to life. And okay, so if everything is mysterious, like how is that a positive thing? Well, the thing is, when everything is mysterious to us, it can also be, in a way, magical and miraculous that things are the way they are. Like the sense that, well, the increasing mystery, the increasing sensation of mystery about life can actually be a way of enhancing the miraculous nature of life. Why? Because when you have like easy lock-dead answers, one of the negative effects of that, although it helps us with our anxiety, but one of the negative effects of that is that it can shut down the miraculous nature of things. Why? Because there's like an easy, direct, obvious answer. Well, great, but like, wouldn't you rather live in sort of a powerful, magical, mysterious universe? And I don't know, my answer personally would be, yeah, I'd rather experience life as an ongoing unfolding of the miraculous. And if the price for that is learning to endure a certain fraction of anxiety and learning to be a little bit more direct and honest about how weird life is and how absurd it is and how many of our questions remain unanswered, well, so be it. Like, which would you rather have? Like, would you rather feel sort of safer and less anxious and at the same time have less of a sense of the magicality of life? Or are you willing to pay a kind of price at the level of anxiety and at the level of uncertainty so that you can gain a more magical sense for what life is about? And, you know, it's a really personal question, but I think that ultimately that's what Camus is getting at. He's inviting us to celebrate, ultimately, life's absurdity. Like, to have enough strength in who and what we are, spiritually and otherwise, existentially, so that we can learn to tolerate reality, that we don't have to run from reality into any narrative, like any deflection from what life is actually showing us. It's possible for us to have direct and honest confrontation with what life is, and to feel perhaps some temptation to run from it into one form of philosophical suicide or another, but yet at the same time to decide that we're not going to do that. And who knows, perhaps life would be lived all the better if we were to cleave to reality as faithfully and as powerfully as we possibly can. So that's probably enough to get you going on Camus. The next video in the series will also be about the same work. It's going to take us several videos to get there, but until then, have a great day and enjoy the corona apocalypse as much as you can. Take care. Bye-bye. Hi. So welcome back once again to Existential Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. We're in the midst of the corona pandemic, and because of that I haven't been able to get a haircut, so my hair is growing increasingly long, and as a consequence I'd like to introduce a little something into this series of lectures, which I like to think of as the ridiculous hat convention, because it's getting so long that it's falling in my face as I'm trying to lecture to you. So here's the ridiculous hat of the day for this lecture. At any rate, what we're going to do today is go further into the myth of Sisyphus by the French-Algerian existentialist Albert Camus. In our last video in this series, we were looking at the myth of Sisyphus, and more specifically at the idea of the absurd, which Camus regards as a kind of ontological category. That is, a basic, fundamental constituent of existence. So from that point of view, it's not just that life seems absurd and ridiculous and strange every now and then, as it well might these days in the midst of the corona vortex. It's because those kinds of experiences are only possible insofar as life is absurd in principle, at the ground level, at the root level. That's the real source of life's absurdity. Now, Camus, in our last video, localizes the central dimension of the absurd as a kind of tension between our desire to know what life is actually about, where we came from, where we're going, if there's a point to it, if so, what is the point to it. That tension between our naturally having a kind of curiosity and desire to know the answers to these sorts of questions on one hand, and life's unreasonable silence on the other. He then gives us analysis of possible responses to the absurd, and he does so in terms of the theme of suicide. The question is, like, how can we be honest about how unreasonable and strange and weird life actually is? How can we be honest about all of that and still find a way of putting one foot in front of the other and not committing suicide of one sort or another? Now, of one sort or another means that for him there are two basic types. First, there's suicide in its most literal form, but more commonly there's a thing called philosophical suicide, which for Camus basically has to do with shutting down our higher brain functions and curiosity about our desire to have answers for these questions, and instead accepting some kind of ready-made stopgap answers with respect to the fundamental questions that we all naturally have, such as, what's the meaning of life? What is the meaning of life? Is there any purpose to it? Is there any purpose to our suffering? If so, what is it? So philosophical suicide, according to his analysis, primarily takes the form of buying into belief systems that provide us with easy, ready-made answers to the disturbing lack of answers to the fundamental questions of life. Religion, from his point of view, is historically probably the most important and powerful mechanism by which we have committed philosophical suicide. But I tried to update that argument a little bit by pointing out that, well, there are secular ways of doing it too. For instance, belief in an ultimately rational, reasonable, scientific/technological utopia could be a way of shutting down the disturbing lack of answers to life's most fundamental questions. Or, I think in our age, probably the most common thing has to do with commodity and entertainment culture, which I think is a way of narcotizing ourselves a lot of the time, away from and numbing ourselves out with respect to the disturbing anxiety we might otherwise feel when we honestly confront how difficult and unreasonable and absurd life actually is. All that stuff from last time. So in this lecture, in this video, what we're going to do is continue along the arc of Camus' analysis of the absurd, but this time, instead of dwelling again, at that tension point between life's unreasonable silence on one hand and our longing for concrete answers on the other, he points out a bunch of other dimensions of the absurd, although the tension between life's silence and our native curiosity he regards as the central dimension of the absurd. That would be an obvious test question when you think about it. Okay, so some other dimensions that appear in the myth of Sisyphus. Okay, as you can see from the notes to the side, repetition and futility is a big part of what makes life absurd. Like when you're really honest about how repetitive a lot of life is, like how much of it is just variations on the same stuff that you've known your entire life, or within the grander scope of things, repetitions of the same stuff that humanity has been dealing with for centuries, millennia, eons even. Like, there's something kind of strange about that, like how repetitive life is, like how many unique moments. You ever wonder about how many sort of genuinely unique moments you actually experience in your life, as opposed to how many moments are just variations of the same old stuff that you're used to in one way or another? And I think the honest answer to that is the vast majority of our lives are just variations on stuff that we've known and that we do every day. It's sort of like waking up. My own personal waking up ritual is sort of like, you know, I wake up, I go to the bathroom, I brush my teeth, I take a shower. It's the same sort of thing. Every now and then I'll break out a new toothbrush or something like that. But for the most part, but there again, it's like, well, breaking out a new toothbrush isn't exactly a monumentally unique event because I've done it many thousands of times before. So the dimension of absurdity is one of the things that makes our lives absurd. Now, in that regard, he compares us to the classical figure from Greek antiquity, Sisyphus, and maybe you remember what happened to poor Sisyphus. So Sisyphus was a kind of lower order god who was condemned by the gods to a life of infinitely repetitive labor in the form of pushing a huge boulder up a mountain only to see it roll back down to the bottom of the mountain, and then he'd have to go back down to the bottom of the mountain and push it up again. And he would have to do that infinitely because he was an immortal. He was a lesser god, therefore immortal. His condemnation for displeasing the gods was infinite repetitive labor. Camus calls Sisyphus, this historical figure from antiquity, the proletarian of the gods. That's on page 121 of your book. So proletarian, of course, is a everyday worker, much like the vast majority of us are, I guess, unless you're a Kardashian or a Paris Hilton or someone like that. Most of us are proletarians of one sort or another. And the point he's making is that if you're a regular everyday person, you're subject to the kind of condemnation that Sisyphus had to endure mythologically. Like, the structure of our lives is a lot like that kind of condemnation when you're honest about how much repetition, how much of the same there is. Nothing new under the sun, as it says in the Bible. Like, how much of that there really is in our lives. And probably, I would say that, you know, more than 95%, probably more than 99% of our lives are just variations on stuff we've been through before. So, in a way, he sees our lives and our existence as a kind of condemnation to the absurd that's true, not only in the form of not getting the answers that we really long for and that would be reasonable, but with respect to how repetitive our lives actually are. So, Sisyphus is the proletarian of the gods, and what I've done here in your notes is tried to illustrate that a little bit. And here is a kind of cartoon that maybe sort of gets that across, you know, like how much of your day is really defined by a kind of circularity. And you may think, but the weekend is something different, right? Well, you've experienced weekends before, actually every weekend, although it seems to be a break from the circularity of your life, is actually just another weekend. It's just another form of circularity. And maybe you think like, well, what happens when you go on vacation? Well, you've been on vacations before too, haven't you? You know, well, what happens, let's say, when you graduate from college? Well, that'll be sort of a unique and distinct moment in your life. Really? You've never graduated from a school before? Because it's just another variation on the same thing, and probably you've done it who knows how many number of times. When you graduated from elementary school to junior high, when you graduated from junior high to high school, when you graduated from high school to college. Now when you graduate from college, let's say you go to graduate school, that'll be another repetition of the same thing. You know, or maybe you'll get a job after you get your degree. Well, in a way, that will be a variation on the same thing too. Once again, you'll find yourself the low person on the totem pole. There'll be a hierarchy already established, a bunch of rules already established. It'll probably be more like graduating from another school and then entering another school than it would be different from that. So the vast majority of our lives is full of all kinds of repetition. Or the coronavirus. Well, you know, like if you get the coronavirus and you get sick, well, you've been sick before. It's kind of like that. You know, well, maybe you would be tempted to think, well, the kind of social situation in which we find ourselves, like that's unique. Well, not really when you look at it in historical terms. The 1918 Spanish flu influenza epidemic was much more deadly than the coronavirus seems to be, at least at this point. But if you really want to sort of go back and compare the coronavirus to something, maybe you could compare it to the Black Plague in the Middle Ages. And boy, you know, there was a plague. There was a pestilence worthy of that ancient word pestilence, almost a biblical type word. But at any rate, even the coronavirus you can see within the larger scope of things as being a repetition of another pathogen dominating humanity, killing us off and leaving the rest in an anxious state trying to survive. It's just the same game. It's just been a little while since we played it. It's been about a century since we played it. All right, so now most of our lives are full of repetition. Now the other side of the condemnation of Sisyphus, though, is that it's not just that his labor is repetitive. The other side of the condemnation is that it doesn't amount to anything. After all, he rolls the boulder up the mountain, he sees it roll back down, he has to roll it up again infinitely. So it's not just the repetitive nature of it, it's the fact that his labor never amounts to anything. There's never a fulfillment of anything. There's never any sort of meaning to it. It's meaningless. And so here too, Sisyphus, or not Sisyphus, but Camus finds that our lives are a lot like that. And at first it can be sort of a sort of harsh thing to realize that that's true. In your notes I sort of went on at some length, I can see, about how you can see it that way. It's like, well, you know, what about your accomplishments? Like, even if your labor is highly repetitive, surely the fact that you accomplish something in your life would break it out of that seemingly vengeful circularity that Camus is suggesting that actually defines our lives. And, well, you know, there's always a perspective from which even the greatest accomplishments shrinks into an infinitesimal insignificance. And that perspective is actually the perspective of reality itself. For instance, from the perspective of reality, do you really think, let's say you have a real high grade average in college, do you think, and you graduate summa cum laude, the highest sort of echelon of graduation during the graduation ceremony, do you really think that in 100 years anyone will remember that fact? Anyone will know that? Anyone will, it will matter to anyone in any way whatsoever? 100 years is not a long time in historical terms, which in turn is not a long time with respect to geological time, which in turn is not a long time with respect to universal or cosmic time. So do you think in the short span of 100 years that your incredibly luminous, powerful accomplishment will matter to anyone in any way whatsoever? And I think the answer is it won't. And neither will mine, by the way. So it's an accomplishment. Do you think anyone in 100 years will remember that I have a PhD, or that I earned a PhD, or four college degrees along the way? You know, No, I think would be the obvious answer. Probably in 100 years, no one will remember my name or anything about me, or even my silly hat of the day gimmick during the coronavirus. Probably in 100 years, people won't remember the coronavirus at all. And that's the way life is. Everything gets sort of plowed under with time. Everything dissolves with time. That doesn't mean that life is a bad thing or anything like that. It's just a way of deflating what would otherwise be our overweening hubris about the significance of our accomplishments and what we do. In 100 years, no one will remember whether you're a good person or a bad person. No one will really remember what you're about in any way whatsoever. And if that's true in 100 years, you can imagine how much more true it is in 500 or 1,000 years, which once again is not a long period of time with respect to reality. The reality of the world we live in, by world I mean the universe, is that it's been around, according to current scientific estimates, age of the known universe 13.7 billion years. Well, that's kind of a long time to wait around for something. I don't know about you. I tend to get impatient after only 100,000 years if I have to wait for something if I have to wait for like a traffic light for like even 10,000 years. To wait at a traffic light for 10,000 years, I don't know about you. I kind of start to get antsy at some point. So what's the point? The point is that like all of our accomplishments, all of our meanings, all of our values, everything we labor for, everything we care about, it's all going to be dissolved. It's all going away, and it's going away pretty soon when you look at it from the point of view of reality itself. So from that point of view, all of our accomplishments don't amount to anything either. A little bit like Sisyphus's condemnation. Well, at this point, because that can be such a difficult, bitter pill to swallow, it's always tempting to defer the meaning of our lives onto something that exceeds the outer boundary of our life. Well, in 100 years, they may have forgotten about me, but if I manage to have children in that time, and my children have children of their own and so on, then in 100 years, in some sense, the meaning or significance of my existence will be perpetuated so that in 100 years, my descendants will be inhabiting the world, and that'll make some kind of appreciable difference. And the obvious counter-argument there would be, well, if it's not at all clear that all of your accomplishments and values and Herculean efforts to be a good person and so on, if it's not at all clear that all of that stuff has any enduring significance with respect to the universe in your lifetime, then why should you expect it to be any different for your children, or for their children, or for their children, or for the human race as a whole, for that matter? Why would you expect the universe to provide some kind of confirmation or affirmation of the significance of the entire human race over all that span of time? And of course, the obvious, I think, observation is that, well, it doesn't. It simply doesn't. The fact, I think you know this, that the Earth itself, I think you know this because it's just part of modern scientific cosmology, that the Earth itself will be destroyed in the current estimate around 4 to 5 billion years as the sun goes through its expansion processes, which is a natural part of the lifespan of stars like our own sun, and eventually it'll expand out and engulf the Earth itself. So the Earth itself is going away, and everything that happened on it will be dust eventually. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Okay, so the unpleasant truth is that all of our efforts are ultimately futile because life doesn't provide any confirmation of what we would think of as their significance or their importance. We're not that important. We're just not that important to the universe. We like to think we are, that's for sure. We like to think that we're essential and that we're the center of things. This was the problem that Galileo ran into in the Middle Ages when he was asking the prelates of the Catholic Church to look into his telescope to observe the moons of Jupiter. So he had this early telescope that he was able to observe the moons orbiting around the planet Jupiter. And the reason why that was so damn significant is that, well, you know, it disproved the idea that everything revolves around the earth, because up till that point in time it was a matter of religious orthodoxy that everything had to revolve around the earth. Well, why does everything have to revolve around the earth? Because we're here. And it's like, well, you know, we're not that important. We're not the center of life, the universe, and everything. In fact, the reality is that, you know, the universe could probably just wipe us away in an instant if it decided to. Who knows? It might come up with a disease, kind of difficult disease for our scientists to manage, one that propagates itself across the populace rather rapidly and has unpredictable effects with respect to its severity and causes people to go into various sorts of anxiety-driven panics and lockdowns of various sorts. Purely hypothetical example, but hey, use your imagination, or better yet, look around. Okay, so the point is that our lives, a little bit like Sisyphus, are full of lots of repetitive activity. There's no affirmation coming from life itself that all of our labors, all of our efforts have any sort of significance whatsoever. In fact, if you look at reality itself, it seems to provide a disconfirmation of that. The universe would probably, you know, annihilate us with a random asteroid like it seemingly did to the dinosaurs, according to one theory. Like, the universe will get rid of us, we're not the center of things, we're not that important, and so on. But that doesn't yet make our lives a kind of condemnation. Important point. What makes our lives a condemnation is the fact that we can be conscious of that. Dramatic silence. Okay? Now, because when you think about it, a lot of the animal kingdom, their lives operate according to a very repetitive, cyclical, futile logic too. It's like a lot of animals' lives are, well, you're born, you grow up, you try to mate, you live the rest of your life, and then you die. The next generation is born, it tries to mate, it lives the rest of its life, and then it dies, and so on and so on and so on. This is an obvious point if you watch nature specials with any frequency, like how repetitive it really is. The thing about animals, as far as we know, is that they're not conscious of the circularity of their lives. They are not aware of how it doesn't really add up to anything, not only with respect to kind of their everyday existence, but with respect to these larger historical arcs, like, you know, dogs and cats, let's say, seemingly aren't aware that, well, you know, all of dogdom and all of catdom, all of their accomplishments, all of their attempts to get into the cat food or the dog food and so on, don't actually amount to anything from the point of view of reality. But they don't experience, seemingly, as far as we know, they don't experience their lives as a kind of condemnation, a kind of absurd condemnation, in the same way we do. Well, why is that? Because they seemingly don't have that reflective capacity to know, to be able to be aware enough of their lives and the structure of their lives so that the repetitive and futile nature of it could be something they can be consciously aware of. And being consciously aware of it, they can agonize about it. Let me turn my phone off for a second. Actually, I'm going to edit that out because I think it's my wife. Hello? All right. So, sorry about that. That was my wife. All right, so what was the point? The point is that what makes the repetitive and futile nature of our existence a kind of condemnation is not just the bare, repetitive, and futile nature of it. To make it a kind of condemnation, you have to be aware of it. You have to be aware of it before you can agonize over it, before it can become something painful, something difficult for us. Because if you're never aware of it, you'll just kind of continue on with the circularity of your existence, much the same way that animals seemingly do. So our consciousness is really part of the absurd. The fact that we're conscious is part of what makes our existence an absurd thing, in a way that it does not seem to be particularly absurd for animals. Animals don't seem to be going around you know, sort of engaging in philosophical suicide, for one thing, and ruminating over what to do about it and ruminating over how difficult it is to be caught in the vicious circularity of life and the futility of life and the fact that life doesn't provide any concrete or definite confirmation of our desires for accomplishment or anything else that we would code as something meaningful. Okay, so maybe let's see if that's enough for one lecture. Maybe it is. Okay. Once again, thanks for being along for the ride, both with respect to this class and with respect to the larger ride of trying to do these lectures via the internet, and the larger ride yet of life and all of its absurdity. Speaking of the absurd in life, boy, I think the coronavirus is really giving us a sense. If you haven't figured it out yet, look around. Check out what's happening. Check out your own feelings and worries and anxieties and so on and so forth, and ask yourself in the spirit of Camus' analysis, could it be the case that ultimately all of that is ultimately an expression of life's fundamental absurdity and unreasonableness? And in a way, the problem is not the coronavirus itself. The real plague is nothing less than our lives. Have a nice day. Hi, so welcome back to Existential Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. This lecture will be the third one in a series on the French Algerian Albert Camus and his work, The Myth of Sisyphus. But before we get into all that, I'd like to continue a tradition I started in the last video, which has to do with trying to keep my hair under control. Why do I need to keep my hair under control? Because it's getting so long and I can't, no barbers are open in the middle of the coronavirus, and so I can't get a haircut. Consequently, I'm going to start wearing probably very unprofessorial hats during these lectures just to keep my hair from flopping in my face. So here's your hat of the day. I'm going to try to wear it back so you can still sort of see my face a little bit in these videos. I'll try to... There we go. All right, so hat of the day in the midst of the coronavirus. And I actually wanted to start out with this lecture by talking a little bit about the coronavirus and why it is freaking us out so much. And the reason why I want to talk about it is going to have to do with some points we're going to make today about Albert Camus and his treatment of hopelessness and meaninglessness. So the question is, why does the coronavirus freak us out so much these days? And the obvious answer is, well, because you can die from it, or at least suffer quite a bit from it. But I've noticed a kind of pattern in the news stories about who gets it and who dies from it and who gets it and who has relatively minor symptoms and all of that. And it kind of goes like this. For instance, yesterday I was reading a story about a 95-year-old World War II veteran who got the coronavirus and who, I guess, did all the logical, sensible things and got through it. On the other hand, I've read stories about 23-year-olds or 25-year-olds or 28-year-olds who are fit, healthy, no prior medical conditions, and yet they ended up dying from it. And I think that's the clue to why it is that we're so freaked out by the coronavirus, especially when you consider the fact that every year in the United States, due to the regular every year seasonal flu, an average of 38,000 people die in the United States every single year over the last 10-year period. I actually looked those statistics up and did the calculation. So 38,000 people die every year from the regular every year seasonal flu on the average. Thus far, due to the coronavirus, we've had a few thousand deaths, and that's certainly tragic, but it's not even yet getting close to the number of deaths attributable to the everyday, every year seasonal flu that we experience. So the obvious question is, well, what's so special about the coronavirus that we're all sheltered and huddled in our homes and fearing it and wearing masks in public when we have to go out and stuff like that? And I think it has to do with some of those news stories, and more specifically with the element of seeming randomness in whom the coronavirus actually ends up killing. It doesn't seem terribly that it's killing off 90% of the time or 95% of the time the elderly, or 95% of the time people with compromised physical systems. Seems like there's a fair amount of randomness in the equation. So I think that that's the key to understanding why we're so freaked out about it, in a way that we're not freaked out about the every year seasonal flu. Like, it's hard to say whom it will cut down, whom it will let off relatively easily with, regular flu-like symptoms or even cold-like symptoms, or seemingly, according to the news, some people get it, don't even know they get it, and yet end up propagating it. It's that element of randomness that is not really there in the everyday seasonal flu, despite the fact that thus far, at least, the every year seasonal flu is much more lethal. So that element of randomness and the kind of terror it inspires in us is going to be a theme very much germane to the element of hopelessness and meaninglessness that Albert Camus takes up within his analysis of the absurd. Okay, so what we've been doing in these last 3 videos is noticing various ways in which life is fundamentally unreasonable, ridiculous, and absurd. Of course, in the first video in this series, the main reason, according to Camus, is that we have in our heart a very rational longing to know what life is about, what its purpose is, what its meaning is, what the rules of the game are, where we come from, where we're going to go when we die, and so on. But the fact of the matter is that life answers none of that for us, so we end up constructing belief systems because we can't tolerate the anxiety of not knowing what it is that we really want to know, what our hearts long to know ultimately. And those belief systems, according to Camus, constitute a form of suicide, a way of sort of killing off the more honest and direct part of our minds that would let these questions hang open and unanswered, despite the fact that they tend to make us anxious. The next dimension of the absurd that we looked at the very last video in this series has to do with being honest and direct and lucid, is the word that he likes in translation, about how repetitive and ultimately how futile a large fraction of our lives really is. Once again, that's a kind of comparison to the mythological story of Sisyphus, who was condemned to roll a boulder up a gigantic mountain, only to see it roll back down to the bottom, to go back down to the bottom, roll it up again, and to do that circular activity infinitely. This character, Sisyphus, was an immortal being, so he had to do it infinitely. And of course, Camus' point is that isn't that how a lot of our lives actually are? Like a lot of repetitive labor, without any definite idea that it actually amounts to anything. Well, after that, the next dimension of the absurd is going to have to do with hopelessness and meaninglessness. So, according to Camus, our lives are actually, when we're honest about it, marked by a kind of hopelessness. Let's look at that one first, hopelessness. Okay, so what does he mean by that? What he means is that a lot of the time in life, and maybe you've noticed this, we hope for things, and I don't know, maybe half the time they end up coming true. Our hopes get fulfilled, and about half the time they don't. No? A little bit like the coronavirus. There seems to be a lot of randomness to the equation of whether our hopes get fulfilled or not, whether we end up getting what we actually hope for in our hearts. Some of the times, yes. Some of the times, no. And so when we look to life for a kind of definite confirmation of the centrality of hope in human affairs, life's response is, well, maybe yes, maybe no. In other words, like the idea that our lives have to center around hoping for things and then having those hopes be fulfilled in some way, well, life doesn't provide any confirmation of that, not any reliable confirmation of that, because about maybe half the time it will fulfill your hopes, and half the time life will dash your hopes, and you'll be left bereft and broken, I guess, on the shore in some sense. So because of that, it's actually an error to suppose that everyone needs something to hope for, which you hear all the time. This is like typical sort of TV talk show logic, like something that they would say on the average TV talk show, and people would sort of automatically like applaud, like it's such an obvious truth. Well, everyone needs something to hope for, right? And all people are like, yeah. You know, well, the fact of the matter is that life doesn't center around getting what we hope for. That hope is a kind of deflection away from the deeper and more unsettling reality, that there's enough randomness in life such that some of the time you'll end up getting what you hope for and some of the time you won't. But the idea that everyone needs something to hope for, or that hope is fundamental to the human condition, that's a deflection away from the deeper reality of things. And the deeper reality of things is that we're lost in a kind of ocean of randomness. And yeah, we hope in the midst of that, but the fact of the matter is that hope isn't central to anything. It's not central to life. The universe doesn't particularly care whether you get what you hope for or not. Life doesn't particularly care whether you get what you hope for or not. Why doesn't it care? Because half the time it'll give it to you, half the time it won't, more or less. And the same is true of meaning. Okay, so let's gloss meaning to help you understand this in the way that Viktor Frankl glosses meaning. Of course, Viktor Frankl is a very famous psychologist, survivor of the concentration camps during World War II, and the progenitor of a school of psychotherapy called logotherapy, which is oriented around finding meaning in life. Well, how does Viktor Frankl think of meaning? I think it's not a bad way of thinking about it, and it goes like this. Well, meaning is about determining some goal in your life that you construe as worthwhile, and then making efforts to try to attain it as best you can. Well, the thing about meaning, if you understand meaning that way, is that it turns out to be a lot like hope. That some of the time you're able to fulfill the kind of goals that would imbue your life with meaning, but a lot of the time you're not. And that's not just true of you, it's true of every human being. That a lot of the time what seems to confer purpose on your life, you'll end up fulfilling, but a lot of the time you won't, you know? And so this business of hopelessness and meaninglessness, I'm hoping you sort of hear a similar thread in the analysis of these, because from Camus' point of view, the real task of existing as a human being is to actually listen to what life is actually telling us, take in what life is actually asking us to experience, and not to deflect ourselves away from that reality by one form of philosophical suicide or another. And for him, hope and meaning, far from being essential to the human condition, are deflections away from the reality that life is actually asking us to experience. They're ways of pinning the value of our lives on something that may or may not end up happening in the future, because the fact of the matter is life is capricious. Life is random. Life is full of all sorts of aleatory, okay, possible vocabulary word, kind of a fancy word for randomness, let's say that. So alia in Latin is the Latin word for dice, like you play dice games. Okay, so randomness, so aleatory. Life is to a large extent aleatory. Let's use your new vocabulary word, hopefully in a cool way. I don't know, you might drop that one in a bar sometime once we get over the coronavirus. So, okay, connection to coronavirus. So in much the same way that the coronavirus seemingly kills off people, not in a completely random way for sure, but there certainly seems to be a fair amount of randomness in the equation. And like I said in the beginning, I think that it's that randomness that freaks us out most about the coronavirus. It's not the fact of its lethality as it's demonstrated itself so far, because the lethality seems more or less on the par as the every year flu that we have. So I think it's the randomness that's really sort of freaking us out. But the thing is that kind of randomness is part and parcel of life, right? So it's really, in the last video I suggested that life itself might be in some sense the plague, and here's maybe a way of making sense of that, like, you know, life insofar as it's aleatory, use of your new vocabulary word, because that's how much I care about you. Because life is so random and capricious and aleatory, it'll cut you down maybe tomorrow, or maybe it'll let you live for the next 50 years. Who knows? None of us can say. Maybe it will provide what you hope for, your deepest hopes and the deepest recesses of your heart, and maybe it won't. Maybe it will allow you to fulfill something that imbues your life with meaning, and maybe it won't. But the harsh reality, and it's a reality that we flee from at every turn pretty much into one form of philosophical suicide or another, is that life is capricious, and that's what we don't want to recognize. Well, Camus is actually asking us to recognize that, because it's real. So there's sort of a famous quote, and I may butcher it a little bit because I'm about to paraphrase it from memory, that goes something like this. The world that's real is not the world that is desirable. So from that point of view, hope and meaning and constructs like that are what we would find desirable. We hope for what we desire, but that's often, not all the time, but often at variance with the reality that life is actually showing us. And I think you can see that in the corona stuff. I mean, man, if you want a confirmation of whether life is absurd or not, look around in these times, in these days of coronavirus, and I think you can find a fairly direct and ready confirmation of how unreasonable and how absurd life actually is. So life isn't tied particularly to our hopes or to our meanings. In fact, it's indifferent to all of that, cycling through your notes a little bit right now. So he sees hope and meanings basically as forms of philosophical suicide, as a kind of disease, as distractions, as a source of disengagement from the reality of the moment, and so on. And he concludes this section of the book by making a kind of pronouncement that I guess has a kind of logical coherence with respect to what he says. Personally, I can go pretty far out in understanding these thinkers and even finding value in what they say, but I think here he goes a little bit beyond even my line, which is quite the accomplishment, when he says on page 61 of your book, because of all this stuff we've talked about so far, what matters most, what counts, is not the best living, but the most living. In other words, another way of committing philosophical suicide related to hope and meaning would have to do with the construct of the quality of our lives. Because a little bit like hope and meaning, like life might provide a confirmation of what you think of as the quality of your life, but you know, there's a fair chance that it won't. Like life will sort of beat you up no matter what you think the quality of your life is. Like, let's say you think of yourself as a good person. Well, the fact of the matter is that sometimes good people suffer the most. Sometimes good people die the fastest. And here maybe I should make note of the fact that Albert Camus wrote another book called The Plague. A little bit topical, I think, for our times, that illustrates that principle. So in his novel The Plague, he was actually more famous for his novels than he was for this particular work we're looking at. And The Plague is, well, it's not one of his most famous novels, but it's certainly one of them. Has to do with describing a whole range of characters that have different qualities and I guess would appear on different places in the moral ethical hierarchy. And the thing about The Plague, as the novel wears on, is you get a sense for how random and capricious it really is. That, you know, sometimes it'll kill off a bad person, but it's equally likely to kill off a good person. You know, sometimes it'll save a good person, but it's equally likely to save a bad, rotten criminal. And so, you know, life is like that, whether we like it or not. So the only question is not whether life is going to be capricious or not. The only question is whether we're going to have enough honesty to look that capriciousness and that randomness in the face and learn to live accordingly, rather than to sort of dwell in the, you know, in the kind of fantasy realm of our attempts to commit philosophical suicide in one form or another, whether it takes the form of pinning our hopes and the meaning of our lives onto some events in the future that may or may not transpire, or whether it takes the form of indulging in the fantasy that our accomplishments actually matter to the universe somehow, which we saw in the last video prior to this one, or whether it takes the form of deflecting ourselves away from the uncomfortable tension between wanting to know the answers to life's fundamental questions and yet being in a kind of existence where that's not provided for us, not even a little bit, is secondary. Like, all of that is secondary. So the question then is, how can we confront all of that and still find a reason to, move forward in life? And the answer to that is for Camus, is going to be cast in terms of the theme of existential defiance. Okay, so we've seen this theme before when we were looking at Dostoevsky and more specifically at Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, we saw the theme of spite and existential defiance, which is, from the point of view of that work, a way of laying claim to sort of the wider horizon of our freedom. So our freedom has to include both the positive and the negative, and so the choices of the negative, although at one level they seem like a kind of repudiation or a kind of scorning of the obvious logic of life, actually provide a access to a deeper range of human freedom than we'd otherwise have, and actually ultimately make our freedom something real rather than something mechanical. That's all from Dostoevsky. So a similar theme we find in Camus. The vocabulary that he uses, the main way he has of describing this, is using the word scorn, which I have there in bold letters in your notes as I'm looking at your notes on my own laptop here. So scorn. So the question is, what is scorn? Now, here let's bring back the idea of the condemnation of Sisyphus. So once again, Sisyphus condemned to this infinitely circular and futile life, although the word life doesn't really fit because Sisyphus is immortal, so a kind of infinite life, that's really a contradiction, because life is defined by death for us, you know. So but in any case, he's condemned to this existence, perpetual existence of circular and futile labor. So the question from that point of view is, how does Sisyphus deal with his infinite condemnation? And the answer to that is going to be by way of this idea of scorn or existential defiance. And of course, hopefully you're already hearing that this is a metaphor for our own lives. Like, how can we take up our condemnation, although we're not gods? We're here for a limited amount of time, but if our existence has some of the defining attributes of a kind of condemnation, and he's suggesting that it does, that we are, in a sense, condemned to live out lives marked to a large extent by absurdity and unreasonableness that takes a bunch of different forms, and we've gone through those, I guess, a few minutes ago. Like, how can we find a coherent and lucid response that does not fall into the trap of any form of suicide? How can we do that? And existential defiance is going to be part of the answer to that. So for Camus, the way Sisyphus can deal with his condemnation is not to accept it. Okay? So that's the first thing. And that's probably the first answer you would think of, would be, well, you know, the way to deal with it is to accept it in some sense. But for Camus, acceptance of the absurd is a non sequitur. Okay, non sequitur, that means it doesn't follow. It's a Latin phrase. It means it doesn't follow. In other words, it's incoherent. It's an incoherent response to the absurd. And the reason why is because if you think that you can accept the absurdity and unreasonable of existence, if you think you can just sort of, I guess, put your arms around it or embrace it somehow, then you haven't yet realized how bad the situation is, how absurd and unreasonable your life really is. Because if you were to really realize it and really feel that at every level of your being, your response would not be one of acceptance. Your response would not be one of embracing or anything like that. Your response would naturally be one of defiance. So the absurd and existential defiance are really tightly interlinked from the point of view of Camus' analysis. And so acceptance, or any form of acceptance, would be a kind of theater to him that is, if not a form of philosophical suicide, at least on the road to philosophical suicide. So the answer is not going to have to do with acceptance as such. So defiance. Now, here maybe the easy way to help you understand what existential defiance is to think about condemnation maybe in its more literal sense. Like, suppose you were condemned to a prison sentence, all right? So you were put in jail and you had to spend some amount of time in prison. What would be the most defiant way that you could possibly go through that experience? And the first couple of obvious answers are not going to be very good answers. The first obvious answer would be to be angry and to fight perhaps everyone and everything within the purview of what you can see and experience in prison. To get in fights all the time with the system, with other prisoners, to just sort of make out and out fighting the leitmotif of your life for that period of time. And the answer, the Camusian response to that would be, well, that's not actually the most defiant thing you could possibly do. And the reason why is because if you're angry all the time by being condemned, in an odd sort of way, you're agreeing with the whole structure of the condemnation, because when people condemn you to prison, you're supposed to be having a bad time. You're supposed to be angry about it, or at least depressed about it. Like you're supposed to be in some kind of negative emotional state, and that's why it's a condemnation. That's why it's a form of punishment. If you were in some sort of positive state, all of a sudden it wouldn't be a punishment as such. So for your incarceration to have the character of a condemnation, you can't just go around being angry and fighting and defiant in that sort of trivialized sense. Here's the second answer that doesn't work. The most defiant thing you could do if you were in prison would be to commit suicide, literal suicide, you know, so to hang yourself perhaps in your cell or something like that. That's not a coherent response either, and the reason why is something a little bit similar to the whole treatment of anger. Like if you decide that the most defiant response would be to kill yourself, well, in a way, once again, you're agreeing with the character of the condemnation, right? So if your response is that you're so miserable that you can't even continue living, in a way, you're doing exactly what the condemnation would have you do. Be miserable. Once again, it's not a condemnation if you're having a good time. So, and maybe you're already starting to sense what the Camusian business of defiance would be in that kind of situation. The most defiant thing you could do would be to have a good time in prison. And the reason why is because having a good time in prison negates the essential character of the condemnation in the first place. Like if you go in and you're happy, and I gave you an example in your notes of Timothy Leary was sort of an example of that, although who is that inside stock trader? Martha Stewart was another example of this. But let's look at Timothy Leary because that's the one that's in your notes. So Timothy Leary, in case you don't know who he was one of these, he was sort of a maverick professor of psychology from Harvard who very early on got into LSD research, and once they made LSD illegal, he decided he was going to continue on extolling the virtues of it as a way of expanding consciousness and all of that kind of stuff. And of course, they made it illegal, so he was doing illegal things in essence, so they put him in prison. Now, the thing about Timothy Leary was that he was a very charismatic rabble-rouser type of character, especially in the 1960s. And so they weren't going to put him in the general population, the prison population, when they put him in prison. They put him in isolation. So isolation, in case you don't know this, is the worst form of punishment. Usually that's reserved for people that murder other people within the prison system and so on, that you're in a concrete cell for, I guess, 23 hours a day or something like that. And so they reserved for him the very worst sort of condemnation. Now, how did Timothy Leary take this up? Well, he got through it, and when they released him, the reporters, of course, wanted to ask him what it was like, and they were expecting a big show of contrition and apology and, well, I was wrong and all of that kind of stuff. Well, here's how he came out of prison. He said, well, yeah, solitary confinement. I spent a lot of time in solitary confinement, and I'll tell you what, it was the greatest experience of my life. You know, being a celebrity, being popular, being a person whose name is in the news all the time meant that I was constantly being run ragged by appointments and interviews and, you know, all the dynamics of celebrity and popularity. And what I really needed was some downtime. I'll tell you what, prison was the best thing. I couldn't have asked for a better vacation. I wanted to get into extended periods of meditation anyhow, and going to prison, and especially solitary confinement, was the best vacation I could have had at this point in my life. I'm incredibly and profoundly grateful for the experience. I feel much refreshed and much happier as a result of it. And hopefully, as I'm going on about this, you can sort of catch the edge of what a clever, in a way, reversal was going on there. It's like, well, damn, we wanted you to have a bad time. We wanted you to come crawling out of that solitary confinement hole with a big show of apology and contrition and all of that kind of stuff. And you're giving us the exact opposite. You're thanking us. And you're telling us it was one of the happiest and most fruitful times of your life because you got to do what you wanted to do anyhow. And it's like, well, damn, you son of a bitch. Like, we try to punish you and you aren't even willing to be punished. Now, are you getting it like that? Do you see how defiant that is? That's the point I'm trying to make. Well, that same kind of defiance might expand out beyond the walls of the prison to the walls of the figurative prison we're all in, which would be one way, I guess, of describing human existence. Okay, I'm sorry. The camera, once again, did its auto shut-off function. So let me just make this a last point, that real defiance in this life, not just in the life of prison, but within sort of the macrocosm of human existence, might not take the form of being miserable all the time or depressed all the time, or seeking to find one form of suicide or another to try to escape it, or at least deflect our attention away from the absurdity of existence and the hopelessness ultimately of existence and the meaningless ultimately of existence. The most defiant thing you could possibly do is to be lucidly aware of all of that and yet be happy. Find some way of being happy nonetheless in your life. Although happiness now is going to mean something very different from what the word happiness normally means, because it's going to be in a very direct and intimate contact with this whole business of defiance, which sets up a kind of paradox. Like, what is the kind of happiness that is at the same time fundamentally defiant? And the second thing I wanted to say, I'm trying to sort of put an end to this video because I think it's starting to get long, is this business of defiance is also what keeps suicide from being a coherent, reasonable response to the absurd. Because if you're really in touch with the absurd, you will be defiant of it. And the most defiant thing you could do with respect to the absurdity of life is not try to escape it. Because a little bit like in a kind of prison condemnation, the most defiant thing you could do would be to end your life out as it will and not escape it. The most defiant thing you could do is to be exactly lucidly aware of what you're going through and at the same time find a kind of happiness in it, which would be the opposite of committing suicide, either literal or philosophical. Okay, I think we're going to have one more lecture on Camus, and that'll set you up for test 2, I'm sorry, on Wednesday coming up. So until then, have a great day. See if you can notice the absurdity of existing in the time of the coronavirus, and wonder about the dimension of randomness in it, and how that is not only what is freaking us out about the coronavirus, but might be something that freaks us out about life itself. All right, have a good day. Bye-bye.